public interest for it not to be disclosed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I start by commending those honourable and right honourable members who have secured this debate and thanking you for allowing it. Can I also pay tribute to the stamina of my honourable friend from North East Fife and others of my colleagues who last night assured that you would have ample time to consider the response to the original application. Mr Speaker, later today, we begin 5 days of debate on possibly the most important peacetime decision this Parliament will ever take. Today also, Ofsted has described the government's treatment of thousands of vulnerable school children in England as a national scandal. We have a major investigation into alleged profiteering with funeral companies. We've had reports from a UN Special Rapporteur and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation highlighting the appalling poverty that exists in this, one of the wealthiest economies in the world. What's that got to do with the motion before us just now, Mr Speaker? Because the only reason that we are allowed to discuss those things openly and without fear, indeed the only reason we're allowed to know most of those things, is because the power of the state to stop us from knowing is tempered by the rights of a democratically elected Parliament. Not tempered nearly enough, in my humble opinion. The Parliament is not democratically enough elected, in my humble opinion. But we do have an elected Parliament to hold back on the excesses of the state, to hold back on the excesses of the government. And that is what today's motion is all about. A Parliament of 650 people, each one of us entrusted to exercise sovereignty on behalf of those who sent us here. A contempt of this Parliament is a contempt for the fundamental principle of the sovereignty of the people. A contempt for this Parliament is a contempt for the people. A government that seeks to place itself above the express will of this Parliament is a government in contempt of the people, and it is a government that has already taken a dangerous step down the road from democracy towards dictatorship. And today's debate is not about the rights and wrongs of the original motion as presented to the House on the 13th of November, because astonishingly enough, the time for debate on those questions was the 13th of November. So let's not spend time today on questions of convention and precedence, of confidentiality of legal advice and of when that confidentiality should be waived. The time for that debate has gone. The time for opposition to the terms of that motion was when you, Mr Speaker, called the question. And at that point, the government instructed its members to do nothing. The government instructed its members not to oppose that motion. I welcome the degree of humility they're shown in now admitting that they got it wrong. But the government having got it wrong is not an excuse for the government unilaterally to seek to change the wording or the meaning behind a decision, a binding decision that has been made by this Parliament. The government seem to have decided they can change that meaning. They've got the audacity to come back here yesterday and today and tell Parliament that they, and not Parliament, know what it was that Parliament decided and know what it was that Parliament meant when we took that decision. Mr Speaker, they are placing themselves above Parliament. They are placing themselves in contempt of Parliament. And as for the legal position document published yesterday that was going to fix it all, that could hardly have been more patronising if they'd had pictures to colour in and rejoin the dots puzzles every so often just to keep us interested. It was not a legal position by any accepted definition of those terms. It was an attempted sop, possibly at some of their own MPs, who I know are in a very difficult position just now, struggling between their understandable loyalty to their government, to their party, to individual ministers, and their overriding loyalty to the people and to this Parliament. And as the Right Honourable Member for Holborn St Pancras has pointed out, the government have made a habit of not turning up if they think they're going to lose. Maybe the problem is they get so used to being allowed to ignore the views and the opinions of Parliament, they forgot that sometimes Parliament takes decisions that they are not allowed to ignore. Maybe that's why they're so upset now. Maybe it's because alongside the issues about what and should not be made available to members of Parliament or to the public, maybe it's because this decision has laid bare the incompetence at the heart of a government that doesn't even know the basics of parliamentary procedure. I'll give way here.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'm just wondering if this commitment to openness now means that he will be asking the Scottish legal officer to publish all of her advice in the Scottish Parliament in future?
Yes, because
And the relevance of that is the debate.
Mr Speaker, I have absolutely no doubt that if the Parliament that represents the sovereign people of Scotland gives a binding direction to the elected government of Scotland, the elected government of Scotland will comply with that binding direction. No such binding direction has been given. But let's not, Mr Speaker, let's not try to deflect attention from the clear and blatant contempt that has been committed against this House with completely false accusations of contempt elsewhere. Mr Speaker, we have a government who are behaving like a football team that doesn't turn up for friendlies if they think they're going to get beat. And then they discover they've missed a cup final and they've forfeited the tie with a notional 3-0 score. They're now back here not only being asked to be allowed to replay the final, but they're complaining that the score's void because the 3 notional goals would all been offside if there had been anybody there to defend them. But Mr Speaker, we're not talking about a game of football with trophies at stake. We're not talking about the sanctity or non-sanctity of the confidentiality of legal advice. We're talking about the most fundamental principle. We're talking about the most fundamental principle that governs our nations. The principle that Parliament can tell the government what to do, not the other way around. And this is not just some temporary individual aberration. It's part of a pattern of government attempts to keep Parliament out of this altogether, restoring sovereignty to Parliament by keeping Parliament out of its own sovereignty. They went to the Supreme Court to stop us having any say on the triggering of Article 50, and they lost. They did their damnedest in here to stop Parliament having any say in the withdrawal agreement, and they lost. They spent thousands of pounds of our money trying to stop a group of Scottish parliamentarians from finding out whether or not Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked, and they lost. The European Court almost certainly now will find that it can be. And I want to pay tribute to the parliamentarians from 5 political parties and 3 national parliaments who brought that decision to the court. I believe that what they have won will prove to be a pivotal victory. But it does raise a question that's too important to be treated as rhetorical, and it raises a question that's highly pertinent to the substance of today's debate. What kind of government goes to court to stop its own citizens from knowing that the government has legal powers but has chosen not to use them? What legitimate reason can there be for a government to want its people to believe that something is legally impossible when the government has already got its own legal advice telling them that it is perfectly possible? Mr Speaker, I refer to this morning's preliminary opinion from the Court of Justice of the EU as simply another example of this government's attitude that the path chosen usually unilaterally by the government is the only one worthy of consideration, and that nobody is even allowed to know that other paths might be possible. They've got their priorities completely wrong, Mr Speaker. They repeatedly tell us, and the Leader of the House said often enough again in her comments, that their ultimate duty is to act in the public interest. But in fact, we have a government that demands that Parliament and the public act at all times in the government's interests, and that is not the same thing at all. The government has taken on itself the right to decide what's in the public interest, not the Parliament that holds sovereignty on behalf of the public. The government declares itself to know better than Parliament what is in the public interest. The government places itself above the decisions of Parliament. Mr Speaker, the government places itself in contempt of Parliament. Early next year, we'll see the 370th anniversary of the day when a Crown King of Scots was executed just a few hundred yards up the road to here for defying the will, not of this Parliament, because this Parliament didn't exist then, but of one of its predecessors. Now, I don't think anyone's suggesting a similar fate for those who are found in contempt of this Parliament, but we should be under no illusions about the gravity of what we're discussing. And we should be under no illusions as to how the mockery from the Conservative benches is being perceived by those who believe that this Parliament should actually be allowed to tell the government what to do. The elected parliaments of our 4 nations, for all the faults and the flaws and the imperfections and the ridiculously outdated procedures and the arcane procedures that the Leader of the House sometimes doesn't like, represent the rights of our citizens. No one has the right to wield power over the people without the consent of the people. In a parliamentary democracy, that consent is expressed through Parliament, not through the office of the Prime Minister or any other holder of the offices of state. When Parliament speaks, it speaks on behalf of the people, and the government must listen. And when Parliament instructs on behalf of the people, and the government must comply. Mr. Speaker, Parliament has spoken. The government must listen. Parliament has instructed. It has not asked, it has not opined, it has not suggested, it has instructed. The government can disagree or moan or complain as much as they like, but they must comply with that instruction of Parliament. Instead, the government seeks to defy the instruction of Parliament. They seek to defy the sovereignty of the people as expressed through their elected representatives. And it is now, Mr. Speaker, for Parliament to take the only course of action open to us, to compel the government to back down.